welcome to the Gift of the Struggle. Today, we are here with Sarah MacCarthy. I met her at some LGBT community work that both of us were attending in Mobile, Alabama. And I thought it was a really important thing that she was doing. So I wanted to bring her on to talk about the importance of data and study and analysis. She's in academia at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how you got to Alabama, because you are not from here.
No. So I guess a little bit about myself. I actually grew up overseas. My mom was an elementary school teacher and my dad was in the Foreign Service. And so when I was really little, I lived in a country called Swaziland. It's now called Eswatini. And then later lived in Egypt and Brazil and Argentina, and actually started my professional life working in global health, and I was focused on HIV. And it was actually when I was living in Brazil, and I was doing my master's and then eventually my doctoral level studies at the Harvard School of Public Health, that I just was sitting in these HIV clinics and I saw who was walking through the door. And I started to meet and engage and get to know a lot of the different people living with HIV. And I saw how it disproportionately impacted people who identify as LGBTQ. And I also started to have a lot of friends who over time became like family. And I think that gave me a really different perspective that emphasized the importance of HIV and the need to address HIV in the larger continuum of health needs. So not only looking at infectious diseases, but also considering primary care, dental, vision, really viewing people as holistic and what are all of our different needs in terms of mental, physical, and then further putting health in the context of also considering education, housing, employment, and really starting to figure out how all of these pieces do and don't fit together. And so I started my career doing LGBTQ related research, and I do what's called mixed methods research, which means I do quantitative analyses, which is taking, big data sets and understanding what they're saying. And then I also really love qualitative research, which is talking to people and understanding and listening to their stories and seeing what's similar and different, and then trying to put those pieces together to see how the quantitative and the qualitative data speaks. And I've been living in Los Angeles, California with my husband and 2 kids for almost 10 years, and I saw a job listing, and the full title is the Magic City LGBTQ Health Studies Endowed Professorship. So just to sort of disentangle what that means, because it's a lot of academic speak. If you have an endowed professorship, it means it is completely protected by the university, and it cannot be taken away, changed, et cetera, when there's a shift in politics. And that's really important in working in the field of LGBTQ health, that regardless of what's happening in the larger political and economic environment, that there is protection to do this work and to really move the science forward. And the job description was just, I thought it was beautifully written. There's a focus on research, which something a little strange about me, but I do love it. And I've found, the type of research I do, which is community-based participatory research. It's the idea that you build friendships, partnerships with local communities, and together, listen to what their most pressing needs are, and then use research practices to work in collaboration to figure out how to address those needs. And then there's a focus on teaching, which I think is truly, one of the biggest forms of advocacy in training the next generation of LGBTQ advocates to understand that the field of LGBTQ health is built on evidence and data to inform practice and policies. It's not something that's, just made up. It's evolving quickly. I think people can feel some fatigue from how quickly the terms, the concepts are changing. And I really think that's a function of just how quickly our knowledge base is moving. And that's exciting. And, I get it. It can be tiring to constantly have to keep up and understand what the cutting edge of research and practice looks like. And then there's this other component of building relationships with the community. And I define community as students, faculty, staff who are LGBTQ themselves, as well as advocates, and then organizations who are working at this intersection. I started off first by building those relationships here in Birmingham, and then where you and I met in Mobile is an example of how I hope to build those relationships beyond Birmingham and really understand who's doing this work across the state and eventually the region. And it genuinely felt like an opportunity of a lifetime to really work across these different domains, from research, practice, and teaching, to address LGBTQ health in a region that arguably has some of the most aggressive anti-LGBTQ programs and policies. And to do this work in collaboration with people who have been fighting this fight for a long time, and to learn from them, and to figure out how I can use my position at the university to really support their work agenda, friends, families, policies, programs, and everything in between.
Yeah, you talked about fatigue of keeping up with all the terminology and all the things that are progressing and changing, but there's also fatigue from the people who've been fighting the fight. And the lack of education, as somebody who's an advocate and somebody who has a gay child who grew up mostly in Alabama, and has seen some of the things that our family has had to endure, and some of the political struggles that we've been met with, and the ostracization after we have spoken out about it, the isolation of it. But I'll tell you what, one of the things that people don't know in Alabama even is about the aggressive anti-LGBTQ laws. And they don't know that based on a religious exemption, medical people can deny service. And I'll just tell you one little personal story. My son was in the oral surgeon's office getting his wisdom teeth out after his first year of college. And he's one of those that can pass. You would never know necessarily if you met him, whether he was gay, straight, whatever. But once he was under, he started singing Lady Gaga. It was on the radio in the background. And I just thought he became more and more evident.
Effeminate,
yeah. He was just letting himself go. And I was reading the book, White Fragility, for a book club, because I had a book club meeting that afternoon. So I'm reading that, trying to catch up with where I'm supposed to be. The doctor sees it and starts making comments about how Black people are too sensitive. And that's what he got out of White Fragility. I'm like, not sure how he got that, but I started to see where his mind was. And my son's got a needle in his arm. He woke up during the middle of surgery, so he's a little traumatized because he could see what was going on and was having pain and things. And all I could think was, I want my kid out of here right now, because I could see the guy's point of view. And I thought, until you have felt that fear, I mean, that's as close as I can come to personal fear, because I am not a part of that community. But as a mother, if your child is at risk,
mama there,
and you immediately engage. And I wanted him out of there that second. And when I expressed that to somebody, they're like, they can't do that. I'm like, yes, they can. You do not know what the laws are. And I think that's part of the problem. So in terms of education, letting other people know that your 19-year-old kid who's just trying to get through his wisdom teeth, he did not luckily realize it because he was too drunk on anesthesia, but I got it real quick. So I think, that's what people are living with, that level of fear in their medical lives, their social lives, their school experience. Luke had teachers turn around and walk in the other direction after we fought against a reading list that was kind of awful for him. But in order to do that, we have to have the research, we have to have the numbers, we have to have the data. So it's like a mixed bag of trying to figure out where to focus, how to find all of the people we need in order to focus on all of the different multi-pronged approaches that we do need. So talk to us a little bit about why this needs assessment, specifically in the data and research that you do in the broader sense. Why does it matter and why do we need it so badly?
Yeah, I mean, to completely oversimplify, like, we don't know what we don't know, right? I think that there's a lot of reasons. And one significant factor contributing to the invisibility of LGBTQ communities is the total lack of data. So at both the state and even at the national level, there continues to be almost a total dearth of data that is representative, that is, and that means, can be reflective of these like larger population surveys to understand if and when there are differences, if and when there are inequities, which means that there's an injustice driving that difference, not just a difference because some people have a tendency to be born shorter versus taller, but really when there are larger structural factors driving those differences. Without that data, we don't know when to tailor programs and policies. So I think that I understand, and I think more so since moving to Alabama and experiencing the most recent wave of anti-LGBTQ legislation, the sense of urgency behind what do we do now, and understanding that often, not always, often good data collection takes time. Quite frankly, any good research does, because fundamental to conducting quality research is doing it in close collaboration with local communities, which takes building trust. Which takes building capacity, both of the researchers and the community members, and then to do it in a really strategic way, such that there continues to be, feedback loops, improvements, dissemination points throughout the research process, not just at the end. And so, and I think at the same time, I had the opportunity to go to Montgomery and sit in on the hearings with respect to SB 184, which was the Alabama specific law that would criminalize providers for engaging in gender affirming care. And I have to say those few days of sitting and listening to both sides, it honestly just renewed my love affair of research. I think that what I saw was having a substantial and significant base of evidence that informs the guidelines. To be clear, that it takes an entire process in order for a guideline to be developed. That is based on not any single study, but truly the conglomeration and the synthesis of those results by multiple experts to decide what in fact is high quality care, and to see the ways in which research fed into that process and ultimately create the base upon which a Trump appointed judge with a conservative history ruled for an injunction, which enables the continued provision of gender affirming care as this continues to go up the courts. So on one hand, yes, it's acknowledging the long timeline for research. On the other hand, in those 2 days with the research presented, I saw how it swayed and informed a significant decision that had immediate impact in the provision of gender affirming care. So I think trying to hold both those things is true, to understand that long timeline and then the ways in which that data can be used to continue to advocate for the provision of high quality care. Both can be true, and the approach in addressing LGBTQ health and well-being needs to be, as you said, multi-pronged, right? Like, we need the long pipeline of research, we need the immediate advocacy, we need the marches, we need the protests, we need all of these different approaches in order to contribute to really moving I don't want to say the needle, because that makes it, just seem so so small and singular, but really advancing the health, well-being, and rights of LGBTQ communities.
Yeah. And so what you were talking about was the law that they were passing that would criminalize gender affirming care for trans youth, right?
Correct.
And so the provision was that they said that care can continue as it goes through the pipeline. So those who are already in process of getting that care will not have to stop right now.
True. Yes, as it continues to go up the courts.
Right. Until there's
so the clinics that are currently providing gender affirming care can remain open and
still do that.
See clients, et cetera.
Right. So I had lunch, or I actually had wine yesterday with a friend of mine who's a trans woman. And I said to her, what impact does it have on these kids to have to stop if that provision had not passed? What would be the impact? And she said, kids would die.
Yeah, 100%.
Because they have had their hopes snatched out from under them. So talk to us a little bit about some of the research that you're doing and some of the data that talks about that kind of thing, about the impact of all of these decisions that are being made by legislators who are not educated or not yet educated on the impact of these decisions on our youth, but not just the youth, the adults too. I mean, it affects the whole entire community and their families. It's not just even the LGBTQ people, but people like me and my whole entire family who would be impacted by Luke not being able to get the health and care that he needed.
Yeah, I think, first focusing on the youth, there is a lot of misunderstanding, as you said, but it's not just misunderstanding. There's also people who know and understand and then have bias, stigma, and discrimination, right?
Right.
So I think to start with the data and what studies have consistently shown, first there's looking at puberty blockers, which essentially what you're doing is buying time.
Right.
You're giving youth just a little bit more breathing room before their body starts puberty to really propel in one direction or the other, to give them a little bit more time to live into the gender that they want to identify with. And the other thing is to try and really think through, if you can, even close your eyes and think about being in your body. And if you're someone who has gender dysmorphia, the idea that how you view yourself is inconsistent with your physical body, then any expression of that difference, the growth of breasts, the growth of genitalia, further exaggerates that hate and discomfort. And so many youth experience high levels of cutting, of suicide ideation, attempts. Puberty blockers give that breathing room. If you take away that breathing room, you're then accelerating a kid towards that body that they hate, and exaggerating that sense of hate. The idea with gender affirming hormones then is that if a child continues from puberty blockers to gender affirming hormones, which not all do and is appropriate, right? The idea is that there's multiple checks, multiple opportunities for the youth, their family, their providers to say, where are we? How is this working? Is this the direction we continue want to go in? That it can enable the youth to go through one puberty, right? Rather than having to go through multiple puberties. And so the data is really quite clear, right? In terms of how access to this care dramatically reduces mental health, negative mental health outcomes, in addition to this whole range of behaviors that I was just talking about: disordered eating, cutting, suicide ideation, attempts. And so this is where I shift from some people don't have education, and that's an important gap to fill. And then there's what happens when people have the knowledge, but then enters the prejudice, bias, stigma, discrimination. So I try and think of other areas of, for example, access to mental health care, right? That for some, counseling can be sufficient, and for others, after going through the medical diagnostic tests, there's a determination that you need access to medication.
Mm-hmm.
And often access to that medication can result in dramatic shifts for the overall health. This is not something that's taken lightly.
Right.
This, there's multiple steps, multiple discussions, both with the youth, the parents. There are some side effects, often being on different mental health medications, there can be, decreased sex drive and other things like that. And what you're doing is weighing the overall mental health versus it's this more balanced discussion and decision making.
Mm-hmm.
I think of a similar systematic scientific approach is taken to the provision of gender affirming care, informed by these guidelines, supported by multiple organizations, both in the US and elsewhere. The science continues to improve to make sure, again, similar to a range of other diseases, that it can be diagnosed with greater certainty than was diagnosed 10 years previous, 50 years previous, et cetera. However, because of the fact that, a focus on trans kid in particular, as well as LGBTQ youth more broadly, as a wedge issue, it's a very tired political play, right? Who is the most disempowered, and then how can we use them to instill fear and elevate a platform to vote largely based on a misunderstanding.
Yeah. Or an unwillingness to become educated or to entertain the idea that you could be wrong.
Yeah, I think that the reason I'm pushing back so much on the idea of education, and trust me, this hurts my heart to do it, because as a scientist, I believe that data equals knowledge equals power. Mm-hmm. And I think it became clear to me in a very visceral way as we're moving through and continue to move through the COVID epidemic, how that knowledge doesn't always translate into action. Yeah. And to ignore the larger political context in which this knowledge exists will ultimately completely undercut your ability to try and address what's happening. And so I just think that when we talk about knowledge, we all need to figure out how to engage more thoughtfully, more empathetically in conversations to try and address these broader range of concerns that aren't just based on fact, et cetera, but the fears behind them, the misunderstandings, the belief systems, right? And how they contribute to literally putting one fact out there and one person reading it one way and another person reading it differently. Yeah. And I think we have really, on all sides of the political spectrum, stunted our ability to engage in those very difficult, very nuanced conversations. And so I think that data is a huge part of it, yes. And also thinking about it's not just on the political floor, right? In arguing legislation. It is, as you were talking about, how do we have those small side conversations, with friends, with family, and do it in a way where it opens a space for honest dialogue and exchange. And I know that this is, an area that I have a lot of growth opportunity.
Well, we all do. And I think
we all do. We all do. And I think only in entering into the conversations with that understanding that we need to hold a space for it to be far more complex and nuanced and complicated than I think currently we're doing. Yeah. I'm not sure anybody's going to really grow in their understanding.
Yeah. And, and that's one of the things as a writer, one of the things I can do is tell people stories, and have tried to do that. And I'll never forget this dinner that we went to that was with my husband and some of his colleagues. And one sat down and said, I don't even know why they announced this. I just must have had a vibe that they were going to tell me who they were. And one said, I'm an evangelical Christian. And the other one said, I'm a Trumper. Just like that. And I was like, oh, my husband looked at me, and I was just there to be the supportive wife. I was going to say the words. My husband looks at me and he goes, what are you going to do? And they looked at me and they said, go ahead. We don't care if you disagree. So I just said, I have a gay son. And they were like, oh. But what I have found to be a good tool in those kinds of conversations, they're like, we can talk, it's going to be okay. And I said, okay, well, if you say so. I try to get to the most base thing we can agree on. And with those two, the most base thing we could agree on was that none of us at that table wanted kids to die. And that's where we launched our conversation from.
It's a common ground, right?
Yeah.
Like
sometimes it's not quite that low of a bar, but if that's the lowest bar you can get to, and you can say kids are dying, and here, you know, my kid's always been pretty well adjusted, and later he's gone through some things that he didn't quite tell me at the time, because we were so entrenched in this book list that had negatively impacted him, that he didn't want to make it worse. So he just didn't tell me certain things that were happening. And he's well adjusted. And they said, well, your kid's great. The principal's like, your kid's fine. I'm like, that's because he's got me as a mother who never cared. But he's still not fine in his community. He still lives in fear of church and of adults. Those are the two worst places. So when I tell that, and I talk about the people that I've interviewed, and I talk about the 19-year-old boy that I talked to who was couch surfing and had tried to kill himself 3 times before he was 19 because he was a gay Black kid in Mobile, Alabama. When you tell those stories, those can't help but have some kind of emotional impact, especially to someone who's a parent, because they can put themselves in the shoes of their child and say, well, I would never want my kid to go through that. But when you're doing those things, what I find is you just feel like it's so individual that it feels like such a small step. You know, and I don't even think I would ever change those guys' votes. I just might have created a tiny little door of empathy where they might think of how someone would feel not to be able to go to a doctor freely, or to be able to trust that when you go to the emergency room, you're going to be well taken care of. Or ask the right questions, or gendered in the right way. Or those simple things, those words that matter so much, especially in young people who have less ability to let things slide, you know. As you get older, and like Terry, my friend Terry's like, if you're trying and you mess it up, I'll get over it. But you know, some kids have a little harder time with giving people some grace, you know. but it's because that's not who they are, and it is disrespectful, and it is not affirming. It's chipping away at their little souls with words. People don't understand just how impactful that can be. So I think when you know the statistics, when I was arguing with the school, I said, do you know the statistics on, you know, depression and suicide in youth? And he's like, LGBTQ youth? He's like, no. And I said, well, I will tell you what it is. So having that at your fingertips, I think at least he started to listen. I met with that principal once a month for a year, and he came around. And he was like, at some point he started taking notes in my monthly meetings. And I was like, this is whoever would have thought, but it's because he loved my kid in spite of at first, and then because of afterward. And he was a good man. He just didn't know, you know, and that's, I think what's hard. So many seemingly good people are making these judgments, or having these biases, and going through voting for people who are going to damage others. And it's a mystery to me why, but I do feel like when you have the knowledge of some data behind you, and you say 40% of LGBTQ youth have thought about killing themselves, is this okay with you as a human being? How do we get to that humanity of everyone? That's what I always try to find, so that we can then have a discussion. And if you don't get mad, if you just say, well, here's my experience, then you have a little bit more of an in. But what do you think? So one of the things that I think some people have a hard time with in terms of data, and it takes a long time, and how do we make that save lives? How does it translate to the end goal, and not even do that, but improve lives? We have to have the data in order to get money
Mhm.
in order to get social and political power.
Mhm.
So how does that thread progress in a place where, like where we are, where we don't have, I mean, our data for Mobile is extrapolated from national data. It's not specific to Mobile because we don't have data.
Right.
So talk about the importance and the process of what that looks like and what we need as a group in order to make that happen.
Yeah, it's tricky because power equals money and money equals power, right? So for example, there's a national survey that's conducted in the US, but Alabama, let's see, I'm trying to think about how I can best explain. All right, so it's the idea that you have to have a certain amount of money to start to even collect that data.
Right.
Right. And often to even collect that initial part of data, you've got to pull together so many different people and organizations, and it's a lot of volunteer time and really doing things on a shoestring. However, what I've seen in my experience is that once you create at least that initial first picture, think of it as a black and white stencil as to what's happening or not happening. You then can use that initial picture to advocate for additional funding. That can be from state organizations, it can be from national LGBTQ organizations. And then as you get that additional funding, you can then start to fill in that picture with not just primary colors, but shading and nuance to really understand what's happening. And the thing is I think it's about like, what's the different type of language for different types of people? So for some people, you're talking about the common ground, right? The idea is that there's different angles and entry points. I think, finding a common ground in terms of what it means to have kids and that experience, that's one point. I think there's also a lot of people who are concerned about finances and what's cost effective. And if we're using limited state tax dollars or limited funding of an organization, how are we going to make sure that that money is spent well, right? And I'm comfortable. Some people may push back against this, but I'm also comfortable with the idea that we can say we need this data in order to more effectively and efficiently use our dollars. There may be certain programs that do not need to be tailored for the unique needs of LGBTQ individuals. We don't know until we look at the data, right? So let's get the data to see if we're spending state dollars on something, which program needs to be tailored to address unique needs versus which is a program that you can roll out regardless of your sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. Like we have all of these different identities. And I think for me, there's this general acceptance that we have differences based on race, ethnicity. We have differences based on age. We have differences based on, sex assigned at birth. I think there's this growing recognition that we also have differences based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But until we're collecting that data, can we then understand if and when we need to pivot in the actual provision of services?
Yeah.
So is that common ground based on a sense of compassion, sense of financial responsibility, right?
That's the thing.
There's
whatever you can
multiple,
go, if it's somebody's pocketbook, if that's all they care about, you've got to find a way to get to that point.
Yeah, you have to speak different languages. And so I think that that having a broader toolkit, right? You just spoke to the importance of stories and how that can really change hearts and minds. And for some people, only big numbers are going to change it. And for some people, only dollar signs. And for some, and for some, and for some. And the idea is, how do we build out our ability to advocate in these different social and political circles in order to motivate meaningful and lasting and sustainable change?
Absolutely. Because I was just thinking about the needs assessment that we're doing for Southwest Alabama. And you talk about the resources that takes. We've got a marketing team because we
Mhm.
have to know how to tell the story and get people to participate.
Yeah.
You've got the researchers that have to be paid. That's not a free service. So they have to be able to find the people to send the surveys to.
The data collectors, right?
Yes, the data collectors. So in doing that, how do we reach the ones that are unreachable? How do we reach the kid who was couch surfing? How do we get him access to an online survey? How do
Yeah.
we word it in a way that different different levels of education and different socioeconomic groups can process and respond? I mean, there are so many different factors. It's not just like, oh, we're going to send out a survey. We've got to find the most needy people that we can in order to get the data that we need to know what they are. And, I used to do social security disability work, and the different experiences of those who had access to healthcare and those who didn't, and the numbers of people that were my clients that had spent time in prison who had schizophrenia but never had access to mental health care. I mean, you want a good lesson in compassion. That was a great lesson in compassion, because this guy was telling me about somebody that he murdered, and he was 12 years in federal prison, and I'm reading his intake, and he's got schizophrenia, and I'm like, did you ever have access to mental health care? And he's like, no. And I said, did all these things happen when you were having an episode or hearing the voices? And he's like, yes.
Mm-hmm.
My child probably wouldn't have experienced that because I have access to healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, access is a fundamental inflection point, right? That I think, I mean, two things that you're speaking to. One, your first question is how do we find people who appear unreachable? And I think, that's something that's evolved a lot in research. There often in the past, there's been this phrase of hard to reach populations, right? And they can be hard to reach either because of great geographic spread. More often than not, hard to reach is that because of problematic legal and policy context whereby it's not safe or criminalized for them to come forward. So people who are often put in that group are people who use drugs. Often it can be people who identify as LGBTQ, and I think using the term hard to reach ultimately speaks to a limitation of researchers. And the primary way to overcome that divide is by building trust with people who are part of that community themselves, so that they can read the questions and say, hey, these are the ones that don't make sense. This is one that like, what, you didn't even ask me about this, and this is really important. It's the idea of meaningful participation of affected communities. So the people who ultimately are trying to serve make sure that they're not an endpoint, but instead proactive participants throughout the research process to make sure that the instrument itself, the data collection procedures, the analysis, et cetera, continue to integrate their lived experience, the challenges, the opportunities, everything that they face. And so for me, it's always been by engaging those individuals themselves in the entire research process that I think has made that hard to reach part fade away. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. So how can anybody who's a listener, what can they do to help?
Okay,
from your point of view.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different things. I mean, first is you can donate your money. there's that.
The biggie, yeah.
And if you don't have money to donate, then consider donating your time, right? And there's a lot of different ways in which our time can be donated. It can be a whole range of different things, helping to drive people from A to B, helping to, in the past it was like stuffing envelopes, but maybe you're a web designer. So, helping to program that survey. I think we all have a much broader range of skills that are useful in some way, shape, or form. And so really thinking through, if you have the financial resources, how to use them. And if you don't, how you can potentially use your time. I think there's also this idea of how can we in both our personal and professional lives enter into those conversations in both small and big ways, right? So how is it when you're in the grabbing the water in the break room and you hear something said, how do you enter in that conversation and say like, hey, what was your intention behind that, right? And help me understand, where you're coming from, because from my experience or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important in terms of how we have these conversations, not to put the responsibility on LGBTQ individuals themselves, right? Because the idea that if you are something, you have to constantly advocate for, it's just exhausting.
Oh yeah.
This is a responsibility of us all, right? How to have more expansive understandings of gender, moving beyond the masculine and feminine, to recognize that we can all be one, the other, both, a mix of in between. And so how in our, as I said, private and professional conversations, can we really try and navigate those difficult conversations, in our churches, in our Bible study groups, in our social circles, at the dinner party? And often it's easier sometimes to not say something, right? To just let the moment pass. But the wound that quote unquote, small conversation or that small slight can leave for yourself, for someone else, whether you know it or not, it ends up being deep over time. And so I think that really thinking through all of those different domains, and then also, get out and vote. Whoever you vote for, just vote and get other people to go vote. It just, we have too much at stake for massive decisions to be made by a minority of people going out to vote. And so really understanding how incredible it is to have the opportunity to vote at all levels, not just, presidential election, Senate, et cetera. But, as we've seen, school boards are powerful. A lot, judges are powerful, right? So understanding and taking the time to, and that's hard. I get it. I mean, I just, voted in my first Alabama election, and I was just, who are these people? I don't understand their, track record, et cetera. And, so taking the time to do your research and finding your own due north, whatever that may be. But really making sure that these big decisions that are being made are reflective of the masses, and not just the few people who got out and did actually vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And to speak to the conversation point a little bit, I always say that until straight people get on board, LGBTQ people will not have power. Until white people get on board, Black people will never have the power they need. We all have to be allies to the people who are the most underserved. And one of the things I do in my personal life is I had a business partner and we had a podcast, and she told me that I talked about my son and his boyfriend too much. And it came off as advocacy. I'm like, well, for one thing, I don't consider that a criticism. But secondly, I talk about my daughter and her boyfriend, or my son and his girlfriend. I have 5 kids. I talk about all of them. When it was a podcast where we talked about our lives a lot, I nicely explained to her, I said, I would never, ever censor myself for someone else's comfort level, because I would never allow my child to see me pretend in any way like he is not the same as every other one of my children in terms of importance and in terms of belonging and in terms of all of the things. So when I speak, I make very sure to never, no matter who I am speaking to, because I know who is going to take note, that when I speak freely, I say my son and his boyfriend, and my daughter and her girlfriend, or my son and his
it's really
girlfriend.
normalizing this range of identities.
And I think those are small things you can do, especially if you have a family member. Do not ever hide. Do not ever accommodate your words for someone else's ears.
Mhm.
Because you can see who notices it and who doesn't. Some are just like, yeah, okay. Other people are like, did she just say
Mhm.
boy and boyfriend?
Mhm.
My
Yeah.
son and boyfriend. So I think there are certain things you can do to try to keep your conversations like you are in your own home. In my own home, nobody cares. And that's just, the poor boyfriend was throwing up yesterday, and we were all calling to check on him to make sure that he knew how to hydrate. They're young and stupid about taking care of themselves. So I think that normalization, even something that small, can go a long way.
Yeah, I
and
agree.
then those people in your circle begin to hear it and think, okay, that's okay that it's Luke and his boyfriend, or Jake and his girlfriend, or whoever. So, but I think you have to, like you said, you do have to find, and you can do it without getting into a fight.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just say, you know what, I have a gay son, and I really don't, it bothers me to hear you speak that way.
Mhm.
Or it hurts me. If you hurt, that sometimes people they care if they hurt your feelings.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing. And so to wrap this up, what, in your move to Alabama, what gifts have you found in this struggle? Because you are fighting a fight that's an uphill battle, especially where we live. So what gifts do you see that come from this kind of work? Because it's got to be daunting a lot.
I mean, I've just been dropped into the most amazing network of LGBTQ communities here in Birmingham. I'm starting to build it across Alabama, and I just think that with such incredible risk also comes resilience, right? And I think that I have been so inspired by the people I've met, the people I'm starting to have the opportunity to work and walk alongside with, and really learning from them in terms of what it means to navigate and advocate. And I just have learned such an incredible amount, and I so appreciate people's grace with me being so new to the South, so new to the region, and the ways in which people have kindly sort of brought me along, welcomed me into their homes, their organizations. I'm amazed at the amount that I've learned, and I am in awe and have so much respect for those who have been here long before me doing this work. And so just really, really holding on to that sense of inspiration, to see how people pull together in such incredibly dynamic and innovative ways to overcome what seems, inevitable. And I think that SB 184 and the provision of the injunction really spoke to that. It was this incredible collaboration of local and national legal and clinical scholars that did what seemed impossible, and they made it happen.
Yeah.
So I just really try and hold on to that and just embrace it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you coming on so much. I think this is an important conversation that we probably don't have enough of. Data seems to be behind the scenes a lot.
Yes.
Especially the process.
Always having to talk about data, though. You just let me know and I'll be back.
Yeah, absolutely. I will definitely have you back. And if you are listening and you would like to help, or if you need to connect with an LGBT group in your area, email me at elizabeth@thegiftofthestruggle.com, and I can help you if you're local, and I can reach out to Sarah MacCarthy.
Absolutely.
And she can help us find you some resources. So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.